first introduced in Toon Chaos, the collector's rare and its subsequent releases going forward would change how Yu-Gi-Oh's rarity distribution was put inside sets, but we are going to be talking about what has happened to this illustrious rarity, as it has effectively caused its own problem and has its own dilemma, as we are seeing the fallout of it at the current time. But before I get into it, as always for this video, I do want to get the shameless plug out of the way, so go ahead, like and subscribe. Remember to turn on your notification bell and join the ad army. We are currently on the storm to 1,000 subs, and it does help out with your support. So let's get that out of the way and jump straight into it. As I mentioned, the collector's rare was introduced in Toon Chaos, and at this point, it does feel like it's been a little while since that set has released, but you know, it's just time goes faster as you get older. The point here is, the collector's rare was originally introduced in Toon Chaos as a brand new rarity for the TCG. Now, the interesting thing about this actual rarity was its release did coincide with some really interesting facts. Now, one thing was that with its introduction, there were cards that were obviously chosen, as most sets work when a rarity is utilized. However, there was a good possibility going into this that the collector's rare would actually be a very important rarity going into the future. This stems from the fact that the collector's rare itself has that, yes, precious word in it, collectors, meaning a rarity designed just for those who want to collect the cards. Now, when you look at the collector's rare itself, it is up to the opinion of whether you think this is collector status, but the point is, if Konami was finally recognizing the collector market and collectors that do collect the Yu-Gi-Oh cards, it was really interesting that this was the rarity chosen, because it finally gave a cemented figure in terms of actually being a rarity meant for collection, meaning that this rarity would be hard to pick up in that terms, but also focus on specific things. As I do think the collector's rare itself had a very powerful step going through the Toon Chaos, or actually going through Toon Chaos itself. So the interesting thing is, if you're wondering, well, what could it be? What could they offer? And what was the goal? Well, three things. First, the fact that Toon Chaos actually was able to release the cards, this meant that cards in the set would have to represent the first rarity release of it well. And actually, for Collector's Rare, it stood out in a pretty good way, focusing on cards that were iconic to the game, as we saw many good old staples from different formats, and especially for GOAT in the case of Black Luster Soldier Envoy at the beginning, getting the first upgrade to Collector's Rare. Additionally, cards like Jack Knight and the Poker Knights also received their rarity upgrade to Collector's Rare, and for a while it seemed that the Collector's Rarity would focus more on giving us nostalgic reprints for people to collect and keep, kind of giving the anime DM binder people a chance to actually build something pretty cool. And additionally, on top of that, with Chaos Creator and the Chaos cards receiving reprints in the set, it gave the fact that cards that were also going to be possibly relevant in the future in terms of the meta, but also going to be receiving prints in these sets, an ability to be rarity upgraded, meaning that they might have the ability to have standing power with this exclusive rarity. As we fast forward, we would also receive the first big problem with Collector's Rare, that being sets. Now, why I bring this up is simple. In Toon Chaos, this was a cultivated set for the TCG, meaning that its reprints in the set were actually going to be whatever, Konami had chosen, but more importantly, this was a set that would have an abnormal reprint count versus some of the other sets going forward. The reason I bring that up is, when you have a set that is primarily being released for the TCG, the cards can fit whatever you want it to be. So in this case, cultivating it with some DM cards, GOAT cards, stuff like that, and adding it to the pool of the support that was coming did actually make sense in terms of giving certain cards the collector rarity. But when we get into side sets that would also be receiving the collector's rare, this changes completely. Now, the main reason for this is simple. When you have a brand new rarity and you want to keep it going, no matter if the set is good or bad, cards must be rarity bumped. And unfortunately, Ancient Guardians is probably the best example of this fact. Now, I don't actually hate this set that much. It wasn't that good, and as a fan of Ogdoadic, I do think that the cards were pretty cool to have their Collector's Rare reprints. But if I had to be honest, this is where the Collector's Rare really showed that it was probably being very underutilized and unimportant. Now, the reason I say that is, if you look at the cards, one of the biggest problem for the actual Collector's Rare here is that the cards in this set were meant to be an expansion for, obviously Konami and Yu-Gi-Oh, so that we had access to new decks. But to be honest, would you want to collect these archetypes was really up to the dependent player choosing to play these very underwhelming decks, entering a metagame where they, one, wouldn't be represented that well, and two, they just did not function to the level of where we would need to do in terms of a modern deck. Now, not every deck needs to be playable on release in terms of tier 1, but it definitely does not help when the decks released are not that good. And on top of that, the set itself would have to put its collector's rares on the backs of generic cards that would really sell the set. Now, the reason for this is simple. Pankratops is the best card and arguably still one of the better collector's rares of the modern day that still sees a good price value. The reason for this is that Pankratops is just a generically good card, and although it does have its place in the anime technically, it doesn't really hold the same level of what we were expecting from the collector's rarity. Now, I do mention this because there were cards of these sets going forward that unfortunately would basically have to become the collector's rares, not because they're nostalgic, not because they're actually that valuable, but it's because they just need to pick cards to be collector's rares. Now, this is very important as we would move forward to some of our other rarity picks, as you start to see other cards that were more valuable in the collector's rarity. Starting off back in Toon Chaos, we saw cards like Gozen Match being one of the premier cards that would be in the actual rarity. But the reason this matters a lot for the set is that when you start to look at cards that were being picked to be collector's rares, there is some affinity for them being important, but there was also a problem. This being that eventually cards like Gozen Match and other cards that are staples may be checked on the ban list, and that's exactly what would happen to something like Gozen Match. But it does not mean that the pick isn't bad. It just means that for the collector's rarity, that this is an okay thing if it's meant for just collectors. But as I mentioned with the last images of Ancient Guardians, it's kind of the problem when you start to see sets printed in collector's rare. You have good picks, you have some really bad picks, and then you have picks that don't make sense. It really starts to devalue what the actual rarity could have been versus where it was going. And as we look at other cards, very much so in Ancient Guardians, another card like Skullmeister was forced to carry the weight of the set, based only in the fact that it was also a CR in that set, and it was one of the better ones, as generically Skullmeister is a good card, and it does see play in the formats every now and then. But if you really compare it to what we would want to see from what the collector's rare could have been, this is a card that getting the rarity bump is cool, but in the end isn't really that important. And then a card like Torrential Tribute is a fantastic pick of a collector's rare that we see in the Grand Creators, but also has a problem where if this card being rarity bumped was only given to CR, as it was among the set list of cards in the Grand Creators, as it is a great addition, and I do think as a collector's rare, Torrential was crazy for the time because it is a good rarity bump. I do think this is another example of what happens when cards are effectively being given rarity bumps to the collector's rarity, but at the same time, they would have to be in the set for us to actually have good collectors. Now, as we would move on a bit and also closing in, there are still cards that warrant their importance in the collector's rare slot. I think Stardust Dragon having its reprint in Toon Chaos and still holding as a pretty solid collector's rare is pretty cool, as it does solve and prove the point of what the collector's rare could have been, being this really interesting new rarity that gave older cards and cards that have really importance to the game some specific importance, and also giving them a rarity where they could be cherished that's hard to get. So kind of giving us everything that people would want in a collection and also chasing. Additionally, we would see modern archetypes that finally would be in the side sets that could see some competitive play, such as Vanquished Soul, which I actually pulled my first CR as a Stake Your Soul from a Wild Survivors box. I know the feeling of it and being important when your actual deck that is going to be in this side rarity may actually be able to be playable in the meta. And as of right now, Vanquished Soul is still meta relevant, but you still see the problem, whereas this rarity is cool, but as reprints would come in to an extent, but also for a set that was kind of on the back of the Vanquished Souls, to be honest, as Wild Survivors was an okay set, but pretty much all the weight was on Vanquished Soul. You start to see the problem with the CR rarity, where yes, it's important, but the sets that they're being introduced in still doesn't really offer what the CR value is for. And of course, we see Molcharmi Perulia, a card that was never in a CR rarity, making its way into a CR rarity in our Maze set, still able to show that the collector's rare actually can hold its own weight as long as it's given to cards that can actually meet the requirements of what the CR rarity really could have lived up to. But, like I said, I've had to clear that out as the introduction to Collector's Rare and kind of the little history bump. We're now going to be going into where the actual dilemma is, the PCR and the QCR dilemma, which has caused the issue we are talking about. Now, jumping into it, clearly the thumbnail was kind of the joke and showcasing the point. It's really just that. With the introduction of the Prismatic Collector's Rare and QCR through our 25th anniversary celebration, quote unquote, the CRs are actually in a bad position. Now, the reason for this is simple. In Rarity Collection, the introduction of Prismatic Collector's Rare and the Quarter Century Rare that would be in mass accessibility thanks to the sets really did put a strain on the possibilities that Collector's Rare actually held. Now, the reason for this is something that many people have talked about, the cannibalism of other rarities and the cannibalism of high rarity cards. But the point is simple. We'll start off with an example of My Friend Purely coming out of the actual Amazing Defenders set. Now, this set wasn't the best on release, but it did shape up later. The point is, in Amazing Defenders, My Friend Purely came out as an Ultra and a Collector's Rare. Now, let me show you side by side, with the problem being the Prismatic Collector's Rare released in the Rarity Collection 2. If you were to look at both of them, tell me the difference. Now, if you're a normal and a constant regular Yu-Gi-Oh player, you could probably tell me the difference between them. You'd see the Amazing Defender stamp, but you'd also see the fact that the rarities are slightly different. But let's be honest, if we're talking about someone who's just simply trying to pick up the card, the Prismatic Collector's Rare and the Collector's Rare are the same thing. Big problem? Collector's Rare. Just adding Prismatic in front of it doesn't eliminate the fact that you still have two specific rarities that are technically different, but they're all about with the same cards. This is why the card pool starts to hurt based on this, because the Prismatic Collector's Rare now devalues the Collector's Rare, because what's the point of the Prismatic the Collector's Rare itself if the Prismatic Collector's Rare still exists, meaning that there's two Collector's Rarity, devaluing the point of the set. Now, additionally, on top of that, all cards in the different sets, for the most part, were also able to come in the Prismatic Collector's Rare, which devalues the actual Collector's Rare even more, because technically more cards and any card of the Rarity Collections would be printed in the PCR available. There are some that were not, but the point is many cards were printed in PCR, meaning that Collector's Rare as an actual rarity period becomes less valued if more cards that are similar enough to it are going to be out on the market, showing that there's no real point to chase. Additionally, when we introduce the QCRs on top of that, you'd see the problem that's going on. If the QCRs were technically considered the highest rarity, this now debunks the Collector's Rares, which were already the highest rarity of the cards prior to the innovation and the introduction of the Rarity Collections. This is important because many cards that were in the Collector's Rare slots were unfortunately cannibalized for this, having multiple printings that would also devalue their original printing, but more importantly being max rarityed out by having the QCR exist. This put the actual Collector's Rares in a really bad spot, meaning that many of them suffer from the problem of just being another rarity among their peers and are devalued, as there is multiple copies you could choose from now. If you really want a CR, you can just get PCR, and if you really want max rarity, unfortunately max rarity is not collectors anymore. It is going to be the Quarter Century Rare or even the Starlight. This problem even plagues today in our sets as we look at something like Modern Justice Hunters, and this is a set I actually opened, and can definitely tell you that although I don't really hate this issue, I do see the problem with it with collectors, being that you are able to pull all three of these rarities, that being Ultra, the Prismatic, and also not Prismatic, the Collector's Rare, and then the Starlight Rare of the cards of Justice Hunters. This does change a very important factor, that the actual Collector's Rare themselves, although are cool, they are the mid rarity now of the side sets, and I do think going forward, if this continues, this will clearly be the case, as we saw something like the Maze set of the last year having secret rares on top of the collectors and supers. I do think this causes a problem we will be seeing in the future, and ultras as well, seeing a problem in the future by adding extra rarities to an already big pool of rarities. We've also seen the devaluing of the collector's market. Now, like I said, this is not meant to be a video focusing solely on market value or trying to explain to people, if you should invest into Yu-Gi-Oh or anything like that. But I do think this is a problem when you look at the importance of actual having value for your cards. And this is something as a budget player, I really do think is an issue. Now, I really like to make sure I have cards, but I'm also not foolish enough to believe that my cards inherently have to have value all the time, because reprints do happen. But I do not like it when cards do come out, and unfortunately, they are not valued that much that quickly. It almost feels like, what's the point of playing a game with some prestige in it with these cards if they're just going to be devalued so fast? Now, like I said, staples deserve reprint wheels, and everybody deserves to have access to it. But for a rarity like Collector's Rare, this could have been one of the rarities to actually ignore all of what I'm saying and be the premier rarity that keeps Konami and Yu-Gi-Oh! Pretty much in its own little realm. I mention this because of the issues going on right now with people in the tins and the starlights that are coming out and the devaluing of the quarter century secret rares that we did see. I do think that Yu-Gi-Oh! Needs to be accessible and affordable, as I think entry and barrier to entry has been the biggest problem to the game in the last about 7 to 10 years. But I will not disagree saying that the fact that they have to cannibalize certain cards doesn't already hurt the market, because it does hurt those that are trying to sell the cards, like the OTS stores, and those that are just trying to make money back on the game when we do these types of situations, as I do believe the Collector's Rare itself should have been a rarity left alone to the collectors to give us a chance to actually build a collection if we feel like it and also play with it, but at the same time give those people who are solely collecting the game something to look forward to, as I think there's nothing wrong with making something very expensive and prestigious in your game if it's meant to recognize the importance of your game. Where I do close off the final part of this dilemma, saying that the QCR, the PCR, did cause a lot of issues with the Collector's Rare itself, as a lot of the Collector's Rares, although are not the worst cards ever, definitely showcase the biggest problem with the side sets, being that if they aren't that good already, then a lot of these decks unfortunately are starved from actually being useful, as their CRs were the only things that were holding up the value of these sets. But because there's always this chance of now these max rarity of the side sets being superseded by Starlight or superseded by, PCR if there's another rarity collection of some sort, there's a good chance that the Collector's Rare unfortunately will fall to obscurity. I don't think this rarity will go away by any means, but I do think now it's definitely looked at as not being that valuable. Now, I do hope this helped you out, and if there's anything you agreed with, let me know down below. If there's anything you disagreed with, let me know down below. Discourse is always important, and I do think for looking at card games like this, it is always cool to have the opinions of others, and as always, this has been Brad from the Ad Army signing off, and for all of you out there, to sign on.